Democrats and Republicans are debating over H.R. 1. Now, this is the House Judiciary Committee, and they're debating the merit of this legislation, which would essentially make it easier for Americans to vote in our country, which is supposed to have a functioning democracy or democratic process. Now, the House Judiciary Committee held an initial hearing on H.R. 1. The For the People Act focused largely on the bill's voting rights provisions. The measures aim to expand automatic voter registration, early voting, and felon re-enfranchisement. The bill also endorses a restoration of the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance provisions that were gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. Just to give you a little more context into what the Supreme Court gutted in 2013, essentially the Voting Rights Act ensured that some of the states that were horrible to, let's say, black voters would have to go to the Justice Department and get permission before they changed their voting laws. Because there was a lot of concern due to the history of this country that some of the red states, some of the southern states would purposely pass voting laws that would make it increasingly difficult for black voters to go out there and vote. And so that's why the Justice Department was supposed to be involved in that.
Yeah, so first of all, H.R. 1's a great bill. When it comes to campaign finance reform, I always want more. So I wish we could end all private financing of elections, and then we will. We'll get a constitutional amendment to do that. This does not do that yet, but it has a number of wonderful provisions that allows more people to vote. That should be a no-brainer if you believe in democracy. But of course, Republicans historically do not want more people to vote. And if you're wondering why, because higher percentages of the wealthy and people who are more likely to vote Republican vote in greater numbers. So those people already vote, so they don't want middle class and poor people who don't vote as often to join the voting ranks. They don't want the young that don't vote as often to join the voting ranks. And they certainly don't want minorities who historically don't vote in the same percentages to become voters as well, because they're all more likely to be Democratic voters. Plus, they're minorities, and young people, and all other people that Republicans don't care about. So,
right, and so instead of maybe caring about them and realizing, hey, maybe we should propose policies that look out for everyone, not just the wealthy, not just the people who have been placed in places of privilege in this country, they think, no, we don't want to serve them. Why don't we go ahead and make it increasingly difficult for them to vote? That way we don't have to worry about them as a constituency.
So among the different things that they debated in this particular resolution, the Republicans have some things that I disagree with, and I'll explain that, and other things that are really not arguable. So they're forced to, as usual, lie about them. So what's a legitimate thing to disagree about, even though most of the country is seemingly weighed in on it? So. And by most of the country, I mean it's just bipartisan, not necessarily that every state participated in these kind of ballot measures. So the arguable one is, should felons have voting rights? Now, I absolutely think they should. In Florida, when there was a ballot measure, it passed overwhelmingly with both Democratic and Republican support. There are Republican governors in places in the middle of the country that are saying, yes, we think that felons should regain their voting rights when they come out. But you could have an argument about that.
Well, there were Republicans who wanted to have that argument. So I'm gonna go to Representative Gates, and he listed all the reasons why he believes that people who were convicted of felonies should not be allowed to vote.
I guess to Ms. Gupta, you say that your organization believes that we ought to restore automatically the voting rights of people who've engaged in felonious conduct. Mr. Grant was convicted of a felony. When he's done with his probation and community service and time, should we allow him to vote again?
The Leadership Conference would say yes. After people have completed their sentence and served their debt to society, the right to vote should be restored.
I'm looking at Anthony Bruton. Anthony Bruton committed sex acts with a 12-year-old at knife point. Then he threatened to cut her throat and bury her. He spent 5 years in prison for that offense. Would H.R. 1 have allowed Mr. Bruton to rape a 12-year-old at knife point, move to another state, and then vote against actions that would allow that to be considered at a subsequent sentencing. This bill would allow someone like Nardo Harmon, who broke into the homes of people and raped 11-year-old victims. So he gets out of his house, breaks into somebody else's house and rapes an 11-year-old. But if H.R. 1 were the law and Nardo Harmon did that, he would then be able to go vote against California Proposition 83 that would have required him to wear a GPS monitoring device. There are some things you can do that are so bad. The degradation of people's right to vote, intimidating people from vote, raping children, that probably renders your right to participate in those decisions in the future.
So look, there's two parts to this. One is saying, hey, listen, I'm concerned about very serious criminals voting on specific legislation that might affect them. I think it's a debatable point. There's a second part, which is demagoguery, which is what he's doing.
That's exactly right. Cherry picking extreme cases to make his point.
So in Florida, it affected 1.4 million people. And the overwhelming majority of that are nonviolent offenders, usually things like marijuana possession, etc. So to put them all in the same bucket as child rapists, right, is obvious demagoguery. And so secondly, think about that example for a second. Do you think that it's, well, look, if we have that one guy who gets out of prison and moves to a different state and votes to not monitor child rapists, that somehow that legislation isn't going to pass? Like everybody's gonna be like, oh, that child rapist makes a really good point. Maybe we shouldn't monitor them. I'm gonna vote no. No, it's preposterous, right? So he's trying to take away the rights of actually millions of Americans based on the most extreme and absurd examples.
Exactly.
So if he wants to do an amendment and saying, hey, you know what, I would like to exempt child rapists from this law, he can propose that amendment to this legislation.
Yeah, and we're having a conversation. I agree with you that there are parts that are debatable, right? I don't think that you are unreasonable for believing that. I believe that as well. But he wants to paint a very specific picture on everyone who's been convicted of a crime, even though we know through our years of sharing stories with you that there is a huge population of people who have been convicted for non-violent offenses like drug possession.
And by the way, civil libertarians would say, no, I get it. Some of the crimes committed, including murder, et cetera, are horrific. But that is why we have a criminal justice system. And after they have served their sentence, we have decided as a society that that is the appropriate punishment, and we're done punishing them. So that is the counterpoint to that debate, but that would apply again to a minuscule amount of people. And so he's not trying to fix this bill in his mind, if it needs fixing. He's trying to kill the bill. And does he care about the felon voting rights? A little bit. But what he actually cares more about is, my God, it would allow more people to vote on other issues through early voting, through easier voter registration. And he hates that, because those folks might vote for Democrats.
Oh, he don't like that. Okay, so another part of this that you have to be aware of, and this is just mind-blowing to me in how utterly transparent Republicans are. As we've said, intentions matter. So if they're coming as honest actors and they're really debating the merit of various provisions, that's fine. But they do want to kill this bill, and it's abundantly clear when they bring certain people to represent their argument. I'm gonna skip ahead to graphic 20. Republicans invited Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation and J. Christian Adams of the Public Interest Legal Foundation, two individuals known for exaggerating the threat of in-person voter fraud. So both of them were members of Trump's failed voter fraud commission, which was created to justify the president's false claims that millions of illegal immigrants voted in the last election to help Hillary Clinton out with the popular vote. Now that commission disbanded, guess what? They didn't find anything. Of course they didn't find anything. We didn't have undocumented immigrants voting in the election.
Okay, so let me break that one down. First off, this is the illegitimate part. There is no real debate here. That's why they have to lie. So Trump said millions of illegal people voted to help Hillary Clinton. Then why did they vote just to make a symbolic victory for her on the popular vote, but decide not to vote to give her the election in the critical states? They're like, no, it'd be too much to cheat to get the electoral college win so she could be president. Let's just vote in irrelevant states so she can win the popular vote and claim a moral victory. Yeah, that likely happened. Anyway, of course, when they investigated his own commission, filled with these people who have bad intent, They couldn't come up with any evidence. So they exaggerated some cases, and even other Republican appointees that are just judges, when presented with evidence, were like, no, not remotely true, and threw it out of court. So what did they fall back on? They disbanded the commission. Like, oh yeah, it probably happened, but that's we're not gonna give you our findings, okay? And then the guy who was leading the commission, Chris Kobach, referenced people who had voted illegally throughout decade after decade after decade. It was a tiny number, and when you did the math on it, the amount of people that committed voter fraud was 0.0000025%.
It's a really big problem.
Okay, so these guys are comical. It is not a real issue. It's actually, in some ways, more disproportionate than climate change. At least in climate change, 1 to 3% of climate scientists disagree, right? 97 to 99% agree. In this case, if you're looking at the actual evidence, there are no real people who thinks that voter fraud is a bigger issue than blocking millions of votes through the laws that the Republicans propose. So this is not debatable. They just don't want you to vote.
Instead of having like experts come in and advise this committee on the best path forward, they're like, no, we're just gonna get some crazy partisan hacks to help us make our nonsensical points. And that I think speaks volumes. Secondly, one of the quotes that came out of this meeting was by Representative Ken Buck. He's a Republican from Colorado. And he said, quote, Democrats have a long history of stealing elections. Democrats have a long history of stealing elections. Wait, what just happened it was North Carolina, right?
Yeah, that's
what just happened in North Carolina?
They tried to steal an election.
Yeah, was that Democrats?
Yeah.
So in the midterm elections, give me a case where Democrats tried to steal the elections.
So I love this one, because when I saw that, I LLOL'd, literally laughed out loud. Okay, but to be fair to him, he did have good examples.
Oh, this is so good.
Okay, so he mentioned Boss Tweed from the 1880s. I'm not kidding, okay? And that's true, he was a Democrat, and that was the 1880s, not the 1980s, the 1880s. And then he went on to mention Huey Long from the 1930s, Richard Daley from the 1960s, anything in this century, anything Bueller, anything. And he finally said, oh, well, yeah, well, remember how they stole the election from Bernie in 2016? Oh, I know, and you were so concerned about that. I mean, these Republicans, they've been looking out for Bernie Sanders for so long.
They really have, yeah,
right?
They're concerned.
Yeah, and that, by the way, was not voter fraud. Those were different issues. How many debates did they set? Did they leak questions to Hillary Clinton? Did they give her an advantage in financing, et cetera, et cetera? That wasn't people going to the polls and Debbie Wasserman Schultz saying, okay, now you vote for Hillary, or changes vote from Bernie Sanders to Hillary Clinton. So I know some people believe that, but there's not great evidence to that effect. There's overwhelming evidence that they rigged it in other ways, but the Republicans did not object to that, do not care about that, and that is not addressed in this bill at all. They got nothing. My favorite, well, that was great. But so my second favorite was Doug Collins from Georgia. He said, we discussed the long lines that actually should be applauded, long lines for voting, right? Oh, really? He said, we have long lines because a lot of people wanted to vote. No, that's not.
He actually had to backpedal later when someone called him out on that.
Okay, so just in case you're unaware, let me just quickly tell you, the reason you have long lines is because they put less voting booths in Democratic areas, in states that are controlled by Republican governors and legislatures, and they put more voting booths in Republican areas. So they don't have lines, they just go in, they vote, and more people filter through. If you have long lines, people have to go to work, people have to go to class, and less people vote. That is why they do it. In fact, in Chris Kobach's state of Kansas, in a Dodge City, which is more heavily Democratic, they moved the single voting booth they had outside of the city and a mile away from a bus station so that those Democrats in that city couldn't vote. So that's why you have long lines, not because, well, everybody's enthusiastic about voting and they got long lines everywhere.
Yeah, it's not a nightclub in Hollywood. Like, it's voting, okay? Right. You don't want the long lines.
2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below, then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell.
And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.